government headquarters in 1970, the U.S. Capitol, the Pentagon, and the Department of State. They took precautions to avoid casualties, issuing warnings before bombings, though some attacks resulted in injuries and significant property damage. The Greenwich Village townhouse explosion in March 1970, where members accidentally detonated a bomb, killed 3 members, and forced many leaders into hiding. And despite maintaining a fugitive lifestyle, the group's activities waned by the late 1970s as the Vietnam War ended and the political climate shifted, and the group was formally disbanded in 1977. Alright, next up we have Janjaweed, and Janjaweed is a militia group that is operated in Sudan's Darfur region. Since the early 2000s, known for its brutal tactics including genocide, ethnic cleansing, rape, and displacement. Composed mainly of Arab nomadic tribesmen, the Janjaweed emerged from ethnic and economic tensions between nomadic Arab tribes and other African farming communities, which was exacerbated by resource competition and political marginalization. In 2003, non-Arab rebel groups SLA and JEM attacked the Sudanese government, accusing it of neglecting Darfur's non-Arab population, and in response, President Omar al-Bashir armed the Janjaweed to suppress the rebellion, using them as a proxy force targeting civilians perceived to support the rebels. The Janjaweed's operations led to millions being displaced and created a severe humanitarian crisis. One of the most notorious Janjaweed attacks occurred in Tawila in 2004, where over 100 were killed, more than 100 women and girls were raped, and homes were burned. The international community responded with condemnation, humanitarian aid, and calls for justice. The UN described Darfur as the world's worst humanitarian crisis in 2004, and the ICC issued arrest warrants for al-Bashir in 2010 for genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The AU deployed peacekeeping forces, but ended up facing numerous challenges. The conflict's intensity had diminished, but the Janjaweed's legacy continues. Many of the fighters have been absorbed in the paramilitary forces like the RSF or Rapid Support Forces, but overall the group's activity has dissipated. Alright, next up we have the Donetsk People's Republic, and the Donetsk People's Republic, or DPR, is a self-proclaimed separatist state in eastern Ukraine, emerging from the 2014 conflict following the Euromaidan protests and Russia's annexation of Crimea. Declared in 2014 by pro-Russia's activists, the DPR, along with the Luhansk People's Republic, sought independence from Ukraine, citing alienation by the new pro-Western government in Kiev. The DPR's origins lie in the political turmoil of late 2013 and early 2014, marked by the protests limiting closer EU ties and the ousting of President Viktor Yanukovych. Pro-Russian sentiment surged in Ukraine, leading to the seizure of government buildings and declarations of independence in Donetsk and Luhansk, and the DPR's leadership included local separatists and Russian nationals. A controversial referendum in May 2014 claimed overwhelming support for independence, though it was widely disputed and unrecognized internationally, and the conflict would escalate into full-scale war with significant support from Russia, including arms and volunteers. Key battles included Sloviansk, Mariupol, Donetsk Airport in the Baltsev, and the downing of Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 in July 2014, killing 300 people, was attributed to a missile launch from DPR-controlled territory, further intensifying international condemnation. The Minsk agreements in 2014 and 2015 aimed to de-escalate the conflict, but saw frequent violations, and the DPR still remains reliant on Russian support, with no doubt members of the group joining against the war against Ukraine, and the conflict has caused significant humanitarian crises, with thousands dead and widespread displacement. Alright, next up we have the Luhansk People's Republic, or LPR, and the LPR is a self-proclaimed separatist state in eastern Ukraine, emerging in April 2014 amidst the political upheaval following the protests and Russia's annexation of Crimea. Now, this is essentially just another branch of one of the separatist states during this conflict. Yeah, it's pretty much, I don't want to say they're one and the same with the DPR, but it's the same idea, I guess. Alright, next up we have Narodnya Volya, or the People's Will, and this group was a revolutionary political organization in the late 19th century Russia, emerging in 1879 from a split in the populist group Land and Liberty. This group advocated for violent action, including terrorism, to overthrow the Tsarist regime and implement political and social reforms. They arose from dissatisfaction with Tsar Alexander II's repressive policies, like the 1861 emancipation of the serfs. The group believed that targeted assassinations would destabilize the regime and incite broader revolution, and their most notable achievement was the assassination of Tsar Alexander II on March 13, 1881, using a series of bombs in St. Petersburg. However, this act led to severe government crackdowns under Alexander III, resulting in the arrest, execution, or exile of many members, eventually leading to the group's eventual dismantling. Alright, next will be up in the Muslim Brotherhood, and this is an Islamist organization founded in Egypt in 1928 by Hassan al-Banna. It began as a movement to promote Islamic principles and values through education and charity, quickly growing in size and influence across the Arab world. Initially focused on social and religious activities, they increasingly engaged in political activism, opposing British colonial rule and advocating for Egyptian independence. During the 1940s, the Brotherhood supported the Palestinian cause and opposed Israel's establishment and developed a paramilitary unit called the Secret Apparatus, which engaged in violent activities leading to government crackdowns. In 1949, Hassan al-Banna would be assassinated, and the Brotherhood would initially begin to support Gamal Abdel Nasser after the 1952 revolution, but continued to face severe repression following a failed assassination attempt on Nasser in 1954. Despite repression, the Brotherhood would survive and reorganize, participating in social and political activities. In the 1980s and 1990s, they expanded their activities, participating in professional syndicates, student unions, and parliamentary elections. Despite periodic crackdowns, it maintained significant presence in Egyptian society, advocating for political reform and Islamic governance. Their fortunes were changed during the Arab Spring of 2011, leading to the ousting of President Hosni Mubarak, and the Brotherhood established the Freedom and Justice Party and won significant representation in elections. In 2012, Mohammed Morsi, a senior Brotherhood member, would be elected the president of Egypt. However, his presidency faced significant challenges, leading to his ousting by the military in 2013, which was followed by a severe crackdown on the Brotherhood. Although the activity diminished in Egypt, the Brotherhood retains influence through its international branches, and they still participate in politics, seen as legitimate in some regions and seen as a terrorist organization in others. Alright, moving on to tier 3. Yeah.
What's up, dudes?
Alright, next up we have the
Polisario
Front, and they are a nationalist movement dedicated to achieving independence for Western Sahara. Founded in 1973 by El Oyali Mustafa Syed, the group emerged in response to Spanish colonization and has since struggled for sovereignty against Morocco, which claims the territory. They formed as Spanish colonial rule declined, gaining support among the Sahrawi population, and in 1975, Spain withdrew from Western Sahara, dividing it between Morocco and Mauritania, which was a move opposed by the Polisario. The group declared the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic in 1976 and waged a guerrilla war. By 1979, Mauritania withdrew, leaving Morocco as the primary adversary. Supported by Algeria, the Polisario established refugee camps in Algeria and continued its conflict with Morocco, which built defensive walls to control the territory. In 1991, a UN brokered ceasefire led to the establishment of the United Nations mission for the referendum in Western Sahara, but the referendum has yet to occur due to disputes. Since the ceasefire, Polisario has focused on diplomatic efforts, and the SADR is recognized by over 40 countries and is a member of the African Union, though major powers like the US and France support Morocco, and tensions occasionally flare to this day. Alright, next up we have the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, and this is a Marxist-Leninist guerrilla group founded in 1964. Initially formed to address rural inequality and land rights, it evolved into one of Latin America's largest rebel groups, financing its operations through drug trafficking, kidnapping, and extortion. FARC's origins trace back to peasant self-defense groups like the Colombian Communist Party, and the FARC aimed to to overthrow the
what was the
Colombian
question?
government.
Can
Throughout
you
the
tell us why the
1970s and
Soviet Union
1980s, it
broke up?
expanded control over rural areas, establishing
Their drummer died?
semi-autonomous zones, and increasing involvement in the cocaine trade. They employed guerrilla tactics,
job,
targeting
Einstein.
military and police
You know
with
the amazing
ambushes,
part? I was just
bombings, and
guessing.
kidnappings, including the high-profile
Man, am I
kidnapping of
hungry.
Ingrid
We should get to
Betancourt.
the
At its peak in the
cafeteria before they run
1990s,
out
the
of
FARC
bread
had
again.
around
My hands are
20,000
still blistered
combatants
from
and
that
controlled
grilled
large
cheese.
territories.
I can't go,
Despite
dude. I
several
got switched to a
failed
new
peace
phys ed
talks,
class.
the group
Hit
maintained
one
its
crybaby
operations
with a
until
folding chair, and
military
suddenly I'm the
offensives
guy
in
who
the
doesn't know
early
how to wrestle.
2000s
But
weakened it
then,
significantly.
who
In
am I gonna go to
2012,
lunch
peace
with?
talks
I don't know.
initiated by
I had to
President
bring this
Juan
beef jerky
Manuel
to tide me
Santos
over.
led to a historic peace
Aw,
agreement in
what a
2016,
ripoff.
and the
That guy
FARC would
sold me a
disband as a
pencil.
militant
Well,
group and
wouldn't be the
transformed
first time I ate
into
a
a
number
political
two.
party,
The last time I
common
won $1.
alternative revolutionary force in
Come on, Del.
2017. Our
Be
next up, we
brave.
had the Euskadi
What's the worst that could happen?
or the ETA, and this was a Basque separatist militant organization founded in 1959. Its goal was to establish an independent Basque state across regions in Spain and France, and initially formed
Good afternoon,
from
everyone.
the Basque
Welcome to
Nationalist
Special Ed
Party's
Phys Ed.
youth
Wait a
wing,
second.
and they were
This is
deeply
special
influenced
ed?
by Francisco Franco's repressive dictatorship, which suppressed
Professor,
Basque
Larry's
culture
bag
and
came
political
up again.
aspirations. They started as a cultural
I'm gonna
and
kick so
political
much ass here,
organization,
it's
but
sick.
soon shifted to armed struggle, inspired by global revolutionary movements. And in 1968, they
Joe,
committed their first
you wanna go
major
to the
violent
cafeteria
act,
with
killing
me?
a Spanish
Interesting.
police officer.
No one's ever asked
This
me
marked
that
the beginning
before.
of a long
But
campaign
no,
of
I'll be
bombings,
transferring out of here soon.
assassinations,
So
and
although it was
kidnappings.
nice of you
And
to
one
ask,
of the most
any social
significant
gesture on
attacks
my
was
part
the
would be pointless.
1973 assassination
What was
of
the
Spanish
question?
Prime Minister
Dude, I'm
Luis
open.
Carrero
Pass it here.
Blanco, which drew international attention. They operated through very small autonomous cells coordinated by central leadership, targeting both military officials and civilians to instill fear and pressure against the Spanish government. And
Thanks
despite
for letting me
ongoing
eat here,
violence,
Todd.
attempts at
Sure.
negotiation were made,
I
but
used to be
ceasefires
afraid of
often
the
collapsed.
cafeteria,
The
too.
Spanish and
I
French
didn't have any
governments would
friends
respond
when I was
with
a
military and
freshman.
police
But now
actions,
that I'm
and
an RA,
anti-terrorism
I
efforts
have
led
40
to the arrest of many
Actually,
ETA
if you count
members,
my
and the group's support
figurines,
base
it's more
eroded
like
over time due to
56.
increased repression
Then
and a
there's
decline
my
in
Star
public
Wars
sympathy for their violent
pillowcase.
tactics.
Oh,
In 2011,
62.
the
I
ETA
didn't
would
used to
announce
count
cessation
Darth Vader,
of armed
but then in the
activities
third
and begin
movie-
disarmament in
Oh,
2017,
and
and
there's
by
the creak
May
in
of
the door,
2018,
which is kind of
ETA
like an old
formally
friend.
dissolved.
I call
Alright,
it
next up we have
Dorsey's Creek.
Rayud Us Salahin, also known as the
Come on,
Martyrs
Del.
Brigade,
Be
and this is a
outgoing.
Chechen
Be like
Islamist militant group
Sanford.
founded in the early 2000s by Shamil
the seat
Basayev,
open?
emerging from the
Sure
broader
thing, buddy.
Chechen resistance against
whole
Russian
table's
rule.
open.
The group is
We would just
infamous
leave.
for its brutal tactics,
What?
including suicide bombings and hostage taking.
Is someone
Their
sitting
most
here?
notorious attacks
No,
include the
hell-
2002
Great. We need these two
Dubrovka
chairs.
theater hostage crisis in Moscow, where around 130
Oh,
hostages and all
this is a
militants died
disaster.
during the rescue
Hiya,
operation,
stranger.
and the 2004
Mind if we join you?
Beslan school
No,
siege,
I
resulting
mean,
in
yes.
333 hostage
Sure.
deaths, including 186
You guys go
children.
to
Following
college
the
too?
death of Shamil
course we
Basayev
do,
in
silly
2006 in a Russian
Hey,
Special
aren't you the one
Forces
who's always hanging
operation,
around
the
that
group's
other guy?
operational
Yeah, the big guy?
capabilities
Oh,
declined.
yeah.
Leadership
That's
passed to Doku
Everyone knows
Umarov, who
Sanford.
declared the
He's like
Caucasus
Mr.
Emirate
Popular.
in 2007.
That guy's a
However,
douchebag.
Russian
What?
counterterrorism
Yeah, he
efforts and the
is.
rise of ISIS
I don't like to
further
use that
weakened
word,
the
but
group.
he is
Today,
a
the group is a
douchebag.
diminished
Yeah, he
threat
is.
with significantly
Douchebag.
reduced
He's a
operational
douchebag.
capacity.
Ooh,
And
I
although
didn't see any
occasional
tacos.
attacks by Chechen militants persist, the group no longer poses the same level of danger as
check
in
it
the
out.
early
Crippled
2000s.
Steve left
Our
his
next up we
wheelchair
have the
outside the
African
showers.
National Congress.
He probably
And
needs
the African
that.
National
Hey,
Congress,
look
or
at
the
me.
ANC,
I'm a
is a political
quadruplet.
party in South Africa, founded in 1912 to advocate for the rights of black South Africans under colonial
wrong with
and
you?
apartheid
This is
rule. The
hilarious. This
ANC's
is even
early
better than the last
strategies
time I
were
stole a
moderate,
wheelchair.
focusing on
I guess
petitions
so.
and delegations to seek redress
Del,
from
what's
the
going
British
on?
government. However,
I'm
the
just watching
establishment of
Sanford roll up
apartheid in
and down the hallway.
1948
What are
prompted
you
the
doing?
ANC to
I'm headed
adopt
over
a
to the
more
student
radical
newspaper. We're
approach.
starting
In the
layout tonight.
1950s,
Wanna
the
come?
ANC launched the Defiance campaign,
Get out of
led
my
by
parking
figures
spot,
such
you
as Nelson
bastards!
Mandela, advocating for
Okay.
nonviolent protests against apartheid
Hey,
laws. The
where are you
Freedom
guys
Charter
going?
was
Wait
adopted in
up!
1955,
Oh my
outlining
God.
a vision for
Sanford's a
non-racial
paralegal.
democratic South Africa. And following the Sharpeville massacre in 1960, the ANC formed its military wing
Ooh, we
and
have a
began
visitor.
an armed
Welcome,
struggle
welcome.
against the
Well, I'm
apartheid
Del.
regime. The South
You probably
African
don't
government
remember me.
responded
We
with
ate
severe
lunch together a
repression,
few
leading
hours
to the
ago.
imprisonment of ANC
Of course we
leaders,
remember
including
you,
Mandela,
goofy
and the
guts.
ANC would
I
continue
can't
to
believe you
operate
guys
from
put together a
exile,
whole
receiving support from
newspaper.
neighboring
How
countries
do you
and
come up
socialist
with all those
nations. Throughout the
ideas?
1970s and
It's a team effort.
1980s,
Right now
they
we're
continued
helping
their
Harry
armed
come up with a
struggle and
headline about
diplomatic
death on
efforts,
campus.
and the
Death on
Soweto uprising in 1976 and the international
on
sanctions to increase pressure on the apartheid regime. President F.W. de Klerk unbanned the ANC and released Nelson Mandela, and negotiations between the ANC and the government led to the end of apartheid and the establishment of a democratic South Africa. The ANC won the first multiracial elections in 1994, with Mandela becoming the first black president. Alright, next up we got the Jewish Underground, and the Jewish Underground, also known as the Koch movement, was a radical right-wing Jewish terrorist organization active in Israel during the late 1970s and early 1980s. Formed by Israeli settlers and activists frustrated with the government's policies towards Palestinians, the group's goal was to establish a greater Israel through violent means, targeting Palestinian civilians and political leaders. The group's violent activities began with the bombing of the Islamic College in Hebron in 1980, killing 2 students and injuring many others, and also carried out bombings of Palestinian mayors' cars in the West Bank, severely injuring 2 mayors. In 1984, Israeli security services arrested several key members of the Jewish Underground, uncovering their violent plans. The subsequent trial revealed the group's extremist ideology, leading to lengthy prison sentences for many members. However, several sentences were later commuted or reduced due to political pressure and public sympathy. Despite the crackdown, the group's ideological legacy persisted, influencing subsequent generations of extremist settlers. Alright, next up we have the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, or the LTTE, or the Tamil Tigers, and they were a militant organization in Sri Lanka from the late 1970s until 2009, and they aimed to create an independent Tamil state in northern and eastern Sri Lanka, rooted in ethnic tensions between Sinhalese majority and Tamil minority. Their origins date back to the post-colonial period, when policies by Sinhalese dominated governments marginalized Tamils, leading to discrimination in education, employment, and politics. Founded in 1976, their first major attack in 1983 sparked anti-Tamil riots and full-scale civil war. Throughout the 80s and 90s, they conducted effective guerrilla warfare, including high-profile assassinations like those of Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi in 1991 and Sri Lankan President in 1993. They established a de facto state in controlled areas with their own administration, police, courts, and military capabilities, including the Sea Tigers and Air Tigers. Peace efforts such as the 2002 ceasefire broken in by Norway failed as both sides violated agreements, and the final phase of the conflict began in 2006 with the Sri Lankan government launching a military offensive. By May of 2009, government forces encircled the remaining Tamil Tiger fighters, leading to the death of their leader and the defeat of the Tigers. The Civil War resulted in a significant loss of life, which estimates 70 to 100,000 people were killed, and the final stages were marked by allegations of severe human rights abuses and war crimes by both sides. Alright, next up we have Lehigh, and Lehigh, also known as the Stern Gang, was a Zionist paramilitary organization founded in 1940 in Palestine. Lehigh's primary objective was to forcibly evict the British from Palestine and establish a Jewish state, and unlike other Zionist groups, they were willing to collaborate with any force, including Axis powers. During World War II, they adopted extreme measures, which included targeted assassinations and bombings. One of their earliest actions was the assassination of Lord Wayne, British minister of the state from the Middle East in 1944, and they were also responsible for the assassination of Count Folke Bernadotte, who was a UN mediator in 1948. Their tactics included bombings such as the 1946 bombing of the British administrative offices, which killed 91 people, and they operated with small, tightly knit cells. Despite significant opposition from British authorities and other Jewish groups, Lehigh continued its activities until the end of the British mandate in 1948. With the establishment of Israel, Lehigh members were absorbed into the Israel Defense Forces, or IDF. Notably, the former Lehigh leader, Yitzhak Shamir, became the Prime Minister of Israel, being viewed by some as heroic and by others as controversial due to their violent methods and willingness to collaborate with Axis powers. Alright, next up we have the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, and this was a radical, anti-racist organization founded in 1978 by former members of the Weather Underground. Named after the abolitionist John Brown, they aimed to combat white supremacy, specifically targeting the Ku Klux Klan and other racist groups, and their ideology was rooted in Marxism, Leninism, and anti-imperialism. They engaged in surveillance and intelligence gathering of Klan communities, organized protests, and conducted direct confrontations with Klan members. Despite their militant stance, they faced significant challenges, including surveillance and undermining efforts by law enforcement, internal divisions, and ideological differences. By the late 1980s, their influence waned due to changing political landscapes and a decline in white supremacist activities and shifting priorities of leftist movements. Next up, we have the Houthi movement. And the Houthi movement, also known as Ansar Allah, is a Shia Islamist political and armed group from the Zaidi sect in northern Yemen, founded by Hussein Badruddin al-Houthi in the 1990s. The movement sought to address the marginalization of the Zaidi community, initially focused on Zaidi revivalism in opposition to foreign interference. The group would turn to armed struggle following Hussein al-Houthi's death in 2004, with his brother Abdul Malik al-Houthi taking over leadership. From 2004 to 2010, they engaged in multiple uprisings against the Yemeni government, leading to significant casualties and displacement. During the Arab Spring of 2011, the group's influence grew, culminating in the capture of Yemen's capital, Sana'a, in 2014. This led to President Hadi fleeing to Saudi Arabia and the start of Saudi-led military intervention in 2015. The conflict has resulted in a severe humanitarian crisis with widespread famine, displacement, and destruction of infrastructure. And the Houthis have demonstrated significant military capabilities and have even received support from Iran. Despite attempts at peace negotiations, the conflict continues, and the Houthis maintain control over significant territories in Yemen. Next up, we have the Shining Path, and the Shining Path is a Maoist guerrilla organization in Peru founded in the late 1960s by Abimael Guzman, who was a philosophy professor. The group originated from a faction within the Peruvian Communist Party, advocating for a peasant-led revolution to establish a communist state. They began their armed insurgency in May 17, 1980, rejecting electoral processes and initiating violent conflict to disrupt the political system and mobilize rural peasantry. The group employed guerrilla tactics, including bombings and assassinations, expanding from rural areas to urban centers like Lima. The conflict led to significant civilian casualties and a humanitarian crisis, and the government's counterinsurgency campaign, marked by human rights abuses, further alienated the rural population. One of the group's most notorious acts was the Lukanamaka massacre in 1983, where 69 villagers were killed. Guzman's capture in 1992 weakened the Shining Path, leading to its splintering. Some factions continued the armed struggle, while others turned to criminal activities like drug trafficking, and the government's intensified efforts in the 1990s dismantled much of the group's infrastructure. In recent years, remnants of the Shining Path have emerged in several areas aligning with drug traffickers, and despite reduced capabilities, they continue to pose security challenges to this day. Alright, next up we have Irgun, and Irgun, or Etzel, was a Zionist paramilitary organization in Mandatory Palestine from 1931 to 1948. Founded by dissidents from the Haganah, Irgun sought a more aggressive approach to securing a Jewish homeland. Rooted in revisionist Zionism led by Zev Jabotinsky, the ideology emphasized establishing a Jewish state on both sides of the Jordan River and rejected compromises on Jewish territorial claims. The group's early years were marked by violence, including bombings and assassinations targeting British authorities and Arab opponents. During the Arab Revolt in 1936 to 1939, the group intensified attacks on Arab targets to protect Jewish communities, and the group split in 1937, leading to the formation of Lehigh, which pursued a more militant approach. During World War II, Irgun temporarily collaborated with the British against the Axis powers, but resumed anti-British activities after the war. Notably, the 1946 bombing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem killed 91 people and underscored Irgun's determination to expel the British. With the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, they played a significant role, including the controversial Deir Yassin attack. Following Israel's establishment, they integrated it into the Israeli Defense Forces, or IDF, and the group was disbanded in 1948. Alright, next up we have the Ethniki Organosis Kyprian Agonistin, or the EOKA, which was a Greek Cypriot nationalist guerrilla group that fought the British colonial rule in Cyprus from 1955 to 1959, aiming for a union with Greece. The EOKA launched its campaign with coordinated bomb attacks on April 1955, targeting British installations. The British responded with harsh crackdowns, deploying additional troops and declaring a state of emergency. They employed guerrilla warfare, sabotage, and targeted assassinations, also attacking Greek collaborators. The
Well, what's a
conflict would eventually
uniballer?
end in
That's me.
1959 with the
I had to
Zurich
have one of
and
my
London agreements
testicles removed
negotiated by
because
the
of your
British,
stupid
Greeks, and
Bangkok
Turks,
joke.
and establishing
First you
the
steal my
Republic of
headlines,
Cyprus as
then
an
my
independent state
testicle,
with a
and then my
power-sharing
girl.
arrangement between Greek
can't
and
believe I have two men
Turkish
fighting over me.
Cypriots. Next up we
Well,
have the Jewish Defense
actually,
League,
one and a
or JDL,
half.
and is the far-right Jewish
I guess I
nationalist
lost my
organization
gift.
founded in the United States in
I had a hell of a
1968 by
run.
Rabbi Meir Kahane. The
Is
JDL
this true what
aims
you
to
say?
protect Jews
Yes.
from
I
anti-Semitic
love
attacks
you.
and
I've
promote
always
Jewish
loved
pride
you.
and
No,
militancy,
silly
with the
bones.
motto
I mean about
never
your
again,
gonad.
emphasizing the prevention of another Holocaust through militant self-defense. The JDL was established in response to rising anti-Semitism and perceived threats to Jewish communities,
Sanford?
and initially focused on
help me open the
neighborhood
trunk.
patrols and self-defense training. They soon adopted direct action
Man, am I glad
tactics
to see
targeting
you.
neo-Nazi
Yeah,
groups,
I'm glad
the
to see
Soviet
you too.
Union, and
And
black
your coat. Give me
nationalists.
that.
They gained attention for its campaign against the
What are you
Soviet
doing in
Union's
there?
treatment of Jews,
We're sneaking
staging
into a drive-in
protests,
movie. Wanna come
sit-ins,
with us?
and violent acts to draw
Sure.
attention to the Soviet Jewish
You're not gonna
dissidents.
believe
Their
what I've been
militant
through lately.
methods included bombings,
Some chick
arson,
tried
and
to kiss
assaults,
me.
and the
Dude,
leader,
you
Meir
scored?
Kahane, moved
Without
to
me?
Israel in 1971,
really.
founding the extremist
Well, I
Koch
guess
Party,
so.
which was later
Sort
banned.
of.
He would
That's
then
awesome.
remain
You're
influential
the first
among
one of us to
right-wing
score in
extremists
college.
until
You're
his
like
assassination
Mr.
in
Popular.
1990. Despite his departure, the
Yeah,
JDL
I'm
continued its
Mr.
activities
Popular.
under new leaders, and in 2001, Irv Rubin and Earl Krugel were arrested for plotting to bomb Arab American targets. Rubin died in custody, and Krugel was murdered in prison, and these incidents weakened the JDL structure, but it remains active as a loosely organized network. Our next up we have Earth First, and Earth First is a radical environmental advocacy group founded in the United States in 1980. The group emerged in reaction to perceived failures of mainstream environmentalism, adopting the slogan, "No compromise in defense of Mother Earth," and committing to direct action and civil disobedience. Initially based in the southwestern United States, Earth First quickly gained national attention, focusing on preventing logging in old-growth forests, opposing dam constructions, and protecting wilderness areas. They're known for their direct action tactics, including tree spiking, road blockades, tree sitting, and sabotaging equipment, collectively referred to as ecotage or monkey wrenching. Throughout the 80s and 90s, they conducted numerous high-profile campaigns, particularly in the Pacific Northwest against ancient forest logging, and in the Southwest against uranium mining and desert development. They operate as a
when the
decentralized network,
astronauts landed
allowing
on the
local
moon, they had to
chapters
fight
to
off
act
giant dinosaurs?
autonomously while adhering
Giant
to the broader
ones?
principles of the movement.
makes you think
Despite
there were ever
facing challenges
dinosaurs
in
on
the
the
late
moon?
90s and
Duh.
early
How else
2000s,
would they
with
have
some
gotten to
members
Earth?
shifting to focus on climate change
Sanford?
activism or joining
Del?
more militant
Joe?
groups like
God,
the Earth
what
Liberation
now?
Front,
The
Earth First
corridor meeting
continues
is
to
about to
advocate
begin.
radical
Did Todd say
environmentalism
so?
and direct
That's
action.
me.
Alright,
I'm
next up we have the
Todd.
Great
Doesn't ring a
Eastern
bell.
Islamic
Your
Raiders
resident
Front, and this is
advisor.
a militant Islamist
I
group
helped
in
you move
Turkey
in.
founded in the mid-1980s,
You asked
and
me
they
if my
advocate
hair
for an
was cotton
Islamic
candy?
state governed by
Oh, yeah.
Sharia law
Is it?
and aim
Again?
to revive
No.
the Ottoman
Well, why not?
Empire's glory. The group's tactics include
Anyway, the
bombings,
meeting is starting
assassinations,
in,
and armed
5
attacks
minutes
targeting
ago.
government
Oh, God,
officials,
what kind of
secular
example am I
institutions,
setting?
and symbols of Western influence.
was
Despite
that
Salih's
guy?
multiple
I don't know.
arrests,
Ask
including
that
a
guy.
life sentence in 1998,
Welcome
he
to our
continued to
first
influence the
corridor
group
meeting.
from prison,
I'd
and
like to
throughout
go
the
over some
2000s,
ground
Turkish
rules.
counterterrorism
Woo!
efforts significantly weakened the group, reducing the frequency and severity of
I've
its
posted
acts.
them again
Despite
because somebody
condemnation from
burned down
both the
the copy
Turkish
that was on
government
the
and
bulletin
moderate
board.
Islamic groups,
I added
they
a new
remain a
one that says
persistent,
no
albeit
list burning.
slightly diminished threat in
College!
Turkey. Our next up we have the
If you
Kamala
need to
Party
find
of
me,
Iranian
just check
Kurdistan,
this
also
board.
known as Kamala.
If I'm in
They are
class,
a
the
Kurdish
happy face
political
will be in
militant
the space
organization
mark.
founded in the late
At
1960s.
class.
Inspired by Marxist-Leninist ideology, they sought
You're gonna
autonomy
need to
and
know
rights for
this.
Kurds within a socialist
Okay.
framework. The group emerged
If
in
I'm in
response
my
to
room,
political and
the happy
economic
face will be
marginalization
here.
under the Shah's
Where are you
rule,
now?
and the
I'm
group
in the
focused on
corridor,
promoting Kurdish
but
cultural
please hold
rights
your
and
questions
social justice
until-
through
Which box is
activism.
that?
After the 1979 Iranian Revolution, Kamala engaged in armed
There's no
conflict
box
with
for
the
that.
new Islamic
So for
Republic
all we
regime,
know,
which
you're not
opposed
even here
ethnic
right now.
minority
No,
movements and Marxism.
I'm here.
Throughout the 1980s, they conducted
Oh,
guerrilla
boy.
warfare
I'm
against the
way off
Iranian
script at
forces,
this
aiming
point.
to weaken central control over Kurdish areas. The party established local councils to administer controlled regions, promoting services and political education. Challenges in the late 1980s and early 1990s, including Iranian military offensives, internal factionalism, and competition with other Kurdish groups weakened Kamala, and the collapse of the Soviet Union further impacted the group's ideological appearance. By the 2000s and 2010s, Kamala maintained smaller-scale political and military activities with bases in Iraqi Kurdistan for training and operations. Alright, next up we have Sayar Era, meaning Free Ireland in Irish, and this was a Marxist-Leninist paramilitary organization in Ireland that emerged in the late 1960s. They aimed to establish a socialist republic through armed struggle, combining nationalist aspirations with Marxist revolutionary ideology. Founded by a mix of former IRA members and social activists, the group quickly adopted militant tactics, including armed robberies, bombings, and assassinations. One notable incident was a bank robbery in Dublin in 1970, intended to finance their activities, and they targeted financial institutions and symbols of the capitalist system, viewing them as oppressors of the Irish working class. Prominent figures like Seamus Costello shaped the group's ideology and strategy, promoting the need for a revolutionary vanguard, and they operated mainly in the Republic of Ireland, but also had connections with militants in Northern Ireland, aiming to support the broader Republican struggle against British rule. Disagreements and radical tactics also would eventually alienate potential supporters and created tensions with other Republican factions, and by the early 1970s, the group's influence had significantly diminished, leading to its disintegration, and many members joined other Republican organizations or left militant activism. Alright, next up we have the Zebra Killers, and the Zebra Killers were a group of serial killers responsible for racially motivated murders in San Francisco during the early 1970s. The term Zebra came from the police radio frequency used to investigate the crimes, and from 1973 to 1974, at least 15 people were killed, though some estimates as many as 73 victims. The murders, targeting primarily white victims, were linked to the Death Angels, an extremist faction associated with the Nation of Islam. Although the Nation of Islam has denied any connection, the spree began on October of 1973 with the abduction and murder of Keita Haig and the attack of her husband, Richard Haig. The killings were often marked by brutality, involving shootings or machete attacks. The San Francisco Police Department faced challenges solving the crimes due to their random nature, and they formed a special task force codenamed Zebra to investigate. A breakthrough would come in April 1974 when Anthony Harris, former Death Angels member, provided information that led to the arrest of several suspects, including Manuel Moore, Larry Green, Jesse Lee Cooks, and JCX Simon. The trial, one of California's longest and most complex, began in 1975, and the prosecution relied on Harris's testimony, forensic evidence, and ballistic reports. In 1976, the defendants were convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Alright, next up we have the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or the PFLP, and they're a Marxist-Leninist and secular Palestinian nationalist organization established in 1967 by George Habash. Formed in response to the defeat of Arab armies in the Six-Day War, the group sought the liberation of Palestine through armed struggle and revolutionary principles. It quickly became the leading faction within the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, advocating for secular socialist state in place of Israel and opposing negotiations with the Israeli state. George Habash, the founder, shaped the group's ideological and operational strategies, combining Palestinian nationalism with revolutionary socialism. They aimed to mobilize the Palestinian masses and engage in armed struggle against Israel and its allies. They would gain international notoriety for high-profile militant operations, including airplane hijackings and bombings, such as the hijacking of 4 airplanes in September 1970. Also known as Black September. Their operational strategy also included guerrilla warfare and acts of international terrorism to draw global attention to the Palestinian cause. Their influence would, however, wane in the late 1980s and 1990s due to the rise of Islamist groups like Hamas and the decline of Soviet support. The 1993 Oslo Accords, proposed by the PFLP, marked a further decline in its influence. However, despite this, they continued their attacks into the 2000s. They have also participated in Palestinian politics, maintaining a presence in various institutions. Its political wing, the PFLP General Command, continues to uphold its ideological stance. Alright, moving on to Tier 4. And first off, we have the National Liberation Front of Corsica, and they are a militant nationalist group founded in the 1970s seeking independence from France through political activism and violent insurgency. Emerging from the historical tensions and economic disparities, the FLNC initially used bombings, arson, and assassinations target French authorities and businesses. Despite internal divisions and French counterterrorism measures, they continued their campaign into the 1990s. However, in 2014, the group declared a ceasefire, shifting focus to political advocacy for greater autonomy, cultural recognition, and economic development. Next up, we have the White Wolves, and the White Wolves is a British neo-Nazi group formed in the mid-1990s as a militant offshoot of Combat 18. They advocated for white supremacism, anti-Semitism, and xenophobia. Led by David Copeland, the group sought to incite racial hatred and violence through terror, most notably the 1999 London nail bombings targeting Black, South Asian, and LGBTQ+ communities, which resulted in 3 deaths and over 140 injuries. Copeland's arrest and subsequent sentences led to the group's decline, though it still continues as an underground network. Alright, next up we have the Red Brigades, and the Red Brigades was a far-left Marxist-Leninist terrorist organization in Italy that operated primarily during the 1970s and 1980s. The group aimed to overthrow Italy's capitalist system and establish a dictatorship of the proletariat through armed struggle. Inspired by global revolutionary movements, the Red Brigades escalated from minor acts of vandalism to serious offensives, including arson, bombings, and kidnappings. The most infamous act was the 1978 kidnapping and murder of former Prime Minister Aldo Moro, which marked their peak of influence and initiated their decline due to intensified government crackdowns and public outrage. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, internal strife and leadership arrests further weakened the Red Brigades, leading to factionalism and a loss of centralized control. Despite continued attacks such as the assassination of General Carlo Alberto Dalla Chiesa and the kidnapping of U.S. Army General James L. Dozier, the group's operational capacity dwindled. By the mid-1980s, the Red Brigades had lost much of their support and relevance, and attempts to revive the group in the 1990s and 2000s were largely unsuccessful. And today, the Red Brigades are considered defunct, with their legacy symbolizing the violent extremism of Italy's years of lead. Next up, we have the Ejército de Liberación Nacional, or National Liberation Army, or ELN, an Neo-Marxist-Leninist guerrilla group in Colombia, active since 1964. Founded by radical Catholic priests and left-wing intellectuals, they aim to overthrow the Colombian government and establish a social state. Influenced by liberation theology and the Cuban Revolution, the group engaged in guerrilla warfare, kidnapping, extortion, and attacks on infrastructure to further its revolutionary goals. Over the years, they established strongholds in various regions and financed its operations through involvement of illegal drug trade and other illicit activities. Despite numerous military offensives and peace negotiations, the ELN has remained resilient due to its decentralized structure and adaptability. Notable efforts for peace, including those initiated under President Juan Manuel Santos, faced setbacks due to ELN attacks such as the 2019 Bogota Police Academy bombing. Today, they continue to be a significant security threat in Colombia, with its involvement in drug trafficking and illegal mining sustaining its operations. Alright, next up we have the Organisation Armée Secrète, or the OAS, and they were a far-right French paramilitary group formed in January 1961 in opposition to Algerian independence, led by disillusioned military officers and settlers. The OAS sought to maintain French rule in Algeria through a campaign of terrorism and assassination. Their activities targeted both the Algerian National Liberation Front and the French government, with notable incidents such as the 1962 attempted assassination of President Charles de Gaulle. And the group's violent tactics include bombings, shootings, and sabotage, resulting in significant casualties and widespread fear. The French government's counterterrorism measures, including increased security and aggressive operations, effectively weakened the OAS, and the signing of the Evian Accords in March 1962 ended the Algerian War and paved the way for Algerian independence, which further diminished the group's influence. Following Algeria's independence on July 5, 1962, the OAS's operational capabilities declined rapidly, leading to its disbandment by the mid-1960s. Next up we have Tanzim, and Tanzim, an organization in Arabic, is a paramilitary group linked to the Fatah movement that emerged in the 1990s. Tanzim aimed to organize resistance and protection for Palestinian civilians, The group would coordinate protests, strikes, and armed attacks against Israeli
Right
targets.
after next week's
During the
graduation
Second
ceremony,
Intifada,
Mr.
they also
Wolfschmidt
played a
Mansternowitz.
prominent role,
No
engaging in
names?
numerous
Damn it,
violent
I'm
attacks.
sorry.
The group's activities were seen as a part of broader strategy to pressure Israel
This
for
isn't going very
concessions,
well.
and following
Meeting's
the arrest
over.
of their leader, Marwan, in 2002, Tanzim's influence waned, and today they are largely inactive, with historical significance remembered in the context of the Palestinian struggle for self-determination. Next up we have the Idealist Hertz, and the Idealist Hertz is a nationalist youth organization closely affiliated with the Nationalist Movement Party. Founded in the late 1960s in response to rising leftist movements, the group aimed to promote Turkish nationalism and the Turkish Islamic synthesis, championed by Alparslan Turks. Known for their militant activities in the 1970s, members of the Idealist Hertz, often referred to as Grey Wolves, were implicated in numerous acts of political violence, including assassinations and bombings, contributing to the political unrest that led to the 1980 military coup in Turkey. Following the coup, the Idealist Hertz were severely weakened, but resurfaced in the 1980s with a focus on political and cultural advocacy. They maintained close ties with the Nationalist Movement Party and expanded their influence through educational and social activities. And in recent years, the group has remained active, promoting Turkish nationalism and opposing perceived threats to national unity.
And that's why I think
Next up we have the Earth Liberation Front. The Earth Liberation Front, or ELF, is a radical environmental movement that emerged in the early 1990s, originating from the Earth First movement. Known for its use of direct action and eco-sabotage, ELF aims to combat environmental destruction and promote ecological preservation. The group's decentralized and leaderless structure has enabled it to carry out numerous high-profile attacks, including arson, vandalism, and sabotage, targeting industries such as logging, housing, and research. One significant action was the 1998 firebombing of Vail Resort's ski facility in Colorado, causing an estimated $12 million in damage. The group's tactics and ideology, rooted deep in ecology and biocentrism, emphasize the intrinsic value of all living beings and aim to force industries and governments to change their practices. Now, they remain a sporadic and significant threat, with its potential for violent actions and economic sabotage continuing to concern law enforcement and targeted industries. And while its visibility and frequency of actions have decreased, ELF's influence on the broader environmental movement underscores the complexity of addressing environmental issues through both legal and illegal means. Next up we have the Order of the Nine Angles, and yeah, we kind of talked about them in the cult, but Order of the Nine Angles, or ONA, is a far-right neo-Nazi and satanic organization that emerged in the UK during the late 1960s and early 1970s. They combine elements of National Socialism, paganism, and anti-modernism with esoteric and occult practices, promoting a worldview centered on, quote, aeonics. The group seeks to usher in a new aeon called the Galactic Empire through acts of transgressive violence and the cultivation of an elite human type. Operating through a decentralized network of autonomous cells, they maintain a low public profile while spreading its influence internationally. The group's ideology has inspired violent extremism, leading to several high-profile criminal cases, such as the conviction of a British member, Brian Fleming, for sexual assault, and the arrest of a U.S. Army soldier, Ethan Melzer, for plotting an ambush influenced by ONA teachings. Alright, next up we have Ordine Nuovo, or New Order, and they were a far-right neo-fascist organization founded in Italy in 1956, emerging from the fringes of post-World War II Italian politics. The group sought to revive fascist ideologies and counter communism, aiming to establish a neo-fascist state rooted in authoritarianism and nationalism. Initially formed as a radical alternative to the Italian social movement, the group engaged in political agitation, propaganda, and paramilitary operations, including bombings and assassinations. One of their most infamous acts was the Piazza Fontana bombing in 1969, which killed 17 people and marked the beginning of a, quote, years of lead, a period of heightened political violence in Italy. As we talked about, throughout the 1970s, they continued their campaign aiming to destabilize society and pave way for the fascist revolution. The Italian government would ban the group in 1973, but their influence persisted through clandestine operations and connections with other far-right entities. Trials and investigations into their activities were often controversial, highlighting allegations of state interference and
I drive you home
cover-ups,
tonight?
and despite its
That'd be great.
disbandment, their legacy
Pick me up outside
continues
Andy's
to
pub,
impact
too.
far-right extremism
If I'm
in
not there,
Italy and
check
Europe,
the dumpster.
serving as a reminder of the
Or the
dangers
Indian
of political
casino.
extremism
You
and
have such a
ongoing need
wonderful
for
sense of
vigilance in
humor,
combating
which further
terrorism.
proves to
Alright,
me
next
that
up we
this is
have
the
the
right thing
Socialist
to do.
Revolutionary Combat Organization, or
Ow.
SRCO, and this
That
was
was the
the
plastic
militant arm
meat.
of the
The one
Socialist
that was
Revolutionary
supposed to
Party
last
in
100
Russia that
years.
emerged in the early 1900s to
Anywho,
counter
will you
increasing
marry
repression by
me?
the
I could
Tsarist
never marry
regime.
you.
Founded by
You're
Grigory
an
Gershuni
alcoholic.
in 1902,
I'm not
the
an
group aimed to
alcoholic.
overthrow the monarchy
Alright.
and establish a
You're
socialist state through
really
acts of
ugly.
terrorism and assassination. The
That
SRCO
I can
carried out
accept.
high-profile assassinations,
Sorry,
including those
Todd.
of Interior
You
Minister
remember my
Dmitry
name.
Sipyagin
This party
and
gets
Prime Minister
bittersweet.
Pyotr
My physical
Stolypin.
pain is
Despite
surpassed
internal
only by
scandals,
my
the group
emotional
continued its
pain.
violent campaign,
No, I was
significantly
wrong about
contributing
that
to the
too.
revolutionary fervor
Ouch.
of the early
Ouch.
20th century. The group played a notable role
Ouch.
during the 1905
Ouch.
Russian Revolution
Ouch.
and continued
Ouch.
anti-Tsarist
Ouch.
activities into World War I and the February Revolution of 1917. However, the rise of the Bolsheviks and the establishment of the Soviet secret police, the
Uh-oh, the
Cheka,
fire's
led
going
to the
out.
group's suppression by the early 1920s. Many members were
those are my
arrested,
medical books.
executed,
But if we don't
or
keep the fire
exiled,
going, the dogs will come back.
effectively
This has gone on
dismantling
long
the
enough.
organization.
I'm taking over
Next
this
up we have
floor.
Forever
You're out.
Enduring,
You hear me?
Always Ready, or
Yeah,
Fear.
you're
And
out.
Fear was a
Stand
domestic
it.
terrorist
But
organization
seriously,
founded
you
by
did a really
U.S.
bad
Army
job. You
soldiers
took
based at Fort
problem.
Stewart,
It was too
Georgia
much
in
work
the
for me
early
anyway.
2010s.
Stop arguing.
Fear aimed to
It's
overthrow the
done.
U.S. government through
Now
a
we just
campaign
need
of
to find
terror
a
and
new
violence,
RA.
seeking to
because there's
establish a
clearly
new
no more
political
qualified
order
candidate
based on
than myself.
extremist
Hey,
beliefs.
you.
They were involved in a series of
Take your
violent
damn
incidents,
hands
including the
off
murder
of
of
that
former
mom.
soldier Michael
It's
Rourke
Todd. Todd's
and his
back.
girlfriend Tiffany
You can't
York
come
in
back
December
now.
of
I'm the
2011.
RA.
Investigations
I finally
into
got my
these
single
murders
room.
revealed Fear's
Being
broader
RA is my
conspiracy,
lady,
uncovering a
and no one
significant
steals my
arsenal
lady
and
without a
detailed
fight.
plans for attacks on government buildings, a dam in Washington state, and public officials. The subsequent arrests and prosecutions of
Wait,
key members
that's the ladle you
highlighted the
used to scoop
dangerous
crap out of the
potential of
urinal.
radicalized
That's right,
individuals
hotshot.
within the military.
Fine.
Our next
The
up we have
room and the ladle
Seleka.
are
And
yours.
Seleka is a coalition of predominantly Muslim rebel groups in the Central African Republic that emerged in late 2012 to overthrow President Francois Bozize. The coalition formed in
shut up,
response to the
all of you.
marginalization of the northeastern Central African
Aren't you
Republic
gonna clean
regions
this
and
place
united
up?
several
Yeah,
rebel
it smells
factions,
successful.
including the CPJP,
No,
UFDR,
it
and
smells like
CPSK,
home.
under the leadership of Michel Totodia. Seleka's rapid military campaign led to the capture
I'll
of the
never
capital,
leave you
Angola, in
again.
March of 2013, with Michel declaring himself president. However,
Hey,
Seleka's
Piggy,
rule
Piggy,
was marked by
hey, get on
severe
down there,
violence,
Piggy.
looting, and human rights abuses, escalating sectarian tensions and leading to the formation of Christian anti-black militias. Michel would resign in January of 2014 under international pressure, leading to a transitional government and eventually the election of Faustin Archange Touadera in 2016. Despite these efforts, Seleka fragmented into various factions, creating a complex and volatile security situation to this day. Our next up we have the Charles Martel Group, and the Charles Martel Group, named after the Frankish military leader who defeated Muslim forces at the Battle of Tours in 732, was a far-right anti-immigrant terrorist organization active in France during the 1970s and 1980s. Composed of radical nationalists, the group sought to counter what they perceived as
Why do we
a
all have to
quote,
go to a
Muslim
football game
invasion
together?
of France.
Because
Inspired by
according to my
Charles
RA
Martel,
manual,
the group viewed
this is a
themselves
good
as
way for us
defenders
to get
of
to know each
European
other.
Christian
Now,
civilization
when we
and
cross
engaged
campus
in
to the
violent
football
attacks,
stadium,
including bombings,
everyone has to
arson,
hold
and
hands
assaults
with his
targeting
buddy.
immigrants, left-wing activists, and institutions supporting multiculturalism. Their clandestine cell-based
stranger
structure
equals
made it difficult for law
danger.
enforcement
So
to
don't let
dismantle them,
anyone touch
allowing
you
them
where
to
your
operate
bathing
for
suit
several
covers.
years. The group is now seen as a historical example of far-right terrorism in
Who are
Europe,
we
with their
missing?
legacy influencing
Where's
contemporary
Dell?
extremist movements
I have
to
to
this
go,
day.
Mom. We're
Alright,
going
next
to
up
the
we have
stadium
the
for a
Wagner
football
Group.
game.
And the Wagner Group is a
Yes,
private
I have a
military
buddy.
company known for its
Yes,
involvement in
equals
global
danger, I
conflicts,
know.
often serving the
Who's he talking
strategic
to?
interests of
His
the
mom.
Russian
He calls
government.
her 4
Founded
times a day.
around
Looks like he's in
2014
love
by
with her or
Dmitry
something.
Utkin,
My
the
daddy
group
loves my
gained
mama.
prominence
Put
during
him
the
special
annexation
hug
of
for when they
Crimea
breed.
and the conflict in eastern Ukraine. Wagner operatives have since expanded their operations to the Middle East, particularly Syria, supporting the Assad regime, and to several countries including Libya, Sudan, the Central African Republic, and Mozambique, providing security, training, and protecting valuable resources. Financed by Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is a Russian oligarch with close ties to Vladimir Putin, and he just recently died in a plane crash in August of 2023. There was also a perceived Wagner, revolution where they splintered off against Russia during this whole Ukrainian conflict. I mean, there's not much to know about them other than the fact that their leaders keep dying. It's ironic that the leaders Dmitry Yudkin and Valery Chegalov and Prigozhin all died in a plane crash, likely caused by an explosion on board, and was widely suspected that the Russian state was involved. But they're still operating in Ukraine to this day, so I mean. Alright, moving on to Tier 5. Alright, next up we have RARA. RARA, or Revolutionary Anti-Racist Action, was a Dutch militant left-wing organization active during the 1980s and 1990s, known for its radical approach to combating racism and promoting leftist ideologies through violent means. Emerging from the broader anti-racist and anti-fascist movements in Western Europe, RARA's activities included bombings and sabotage, targeting government institutions and multinational corporations linked to racism and colonialism. Notable attacks included the bombings of Immigration and Naturalization Service headquarters and the Macro supermarket chain. While RARA's militant tactics highlighted significant social issues, they also drew criticism for undermining their cause and alienating potential allies. Increased police efforts and internal divisions led to the group's decline by the mid-1990s, and today RARA is considered inactive, and its legacy is studied as a part of the history of militant activism and political extremism. Alright, next up we have the Entopedian Resistance, or AR, and they are a neo-Nazi and white supremacist organization formed in Australia in 2016, known for its provocative and offensive propaganda promoting an extremist ideology that advocates for a white ethno-state and exclusion or elimination of non-white populations. Operating with a decentralized and anonymous structure, AR has engaged in activities such as defacing public property with Nazi symbols, distributing racist and homophobic propaganda at schools and universities, and harassing minority communities. The group's materials often reference Nazi imagery and slogans calling for a white-only Australia and the violent removal of Jews, LGBTQ+ individuals, and other minorities. Despite law enforcement's efforts to monitor and curb AR's influence, the group's clandestine nature poses significant challenges. Their international networking with other far-right groups and potential for radicalization and violence associated with their ideology remain serious concerns to this day. Next up we have the Nationalist Party of Puerto Rico, and they were founded in 1922, and they advocated for the island's independence for the United States. Emerging from growing discontent with American rule post-1898, the party positioned themselves as a leading voice for sovereignty. Under the charismatic leadership of Pedro Albizu Campos from 1930, the party adopted radical strategies including protests, strikes, and direct action. The 1930s and 40s saw significant clashes with U.S. authorities, most notably the Rio Piedras massacre in 1935. The peak of the party's militancy came in the late 1940s and early 1950s with the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party revolts and assassination attempt on President Harry S. Truman in 1950, which led to the suppression of uprisings and imprisonment of leaders like Albizu Campos. Despite continued advocacy in the 1950s and 60s, the party's influence waned as other political movements gained prominence, and Campos was released from prison in 1964 but died in 1965. Next up we have the Conspiracy of Fire Nuclei, or CCF, and they are a militant anarchist organization that originated in Greece in 2008. They employ direct action and violent tactics